Good morning, IRA. Today, God speaks to us from the book of Daniel, chapter 10, verses 1 to 12 and 15 to 19. In the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar. Its message was true and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used to no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. So I was left alone gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left, my face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. A hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. He said, Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I'm about to speak to you, and stand up, for I have now been sent to you. And when he said this to me, I stood up, trembling. Then he continued, do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. While he was saying this to me, I bowed with my face toward the ground and was speechless. Then one who looked like a man touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and began to speak. I said to the one standing before me, I am overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord. I feel very weak. How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? My strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe. Again, the one who looked like a man touched me and gave me strength. Do not be afraid. You who are highly esteemed, he said. Peace, be strong now, be strong. When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, speak, my Lord, since you have given me strength. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. All right, before we get into this, I gotta say, after years of struggle, hardship, ups and downs, tears, friends, we did it. Yep. And I gotta say, this city is electric. It is such a good time to be a New Yorker right now. I absolutely love it. And then on top of that, to all of our Puerto Rican brothers and sisters, if you're a Puerto Rican Knicks fan, today is like a good day. Well done. And then on top of that, the U.S. with their decisive victory on Friday. Let's go. It was a good weekend, fam. All right. Anyway, all right, that's over. Congratulations to all. All right, I can't believe I'm gonna say this, but this is crazy. The movie The Matrix is 27 years old. So for those of us that remember when that came out, that's stupid. And it's also wild that the Matrix has also become like this weird movie right now with the red pill movement. If you don't know what that is, I'm so happy for you. Don't even bother looking it up. But for those of you that do know what that is, just so that we're aware, I'm going to reference the movie, but it has nothing to do with the red pill movement. Just want to state that explicitly. But if you're not familiar with the movie, everyone in this movie, they're just going about their everyday life. They're going to work, they're going to school, they're walking the streets, not really thinking much about what's happening in this invisible world that sits behind their understanding of reality. What they don't actually see as they go about everyday human life is that there's this war being fought behind the scenes that's determining the outcome of everything that's happening out on the surface. Humans, they think that they're navigating this human world, but there's this very real struggle that's happening at a level that they cannot perceive unless their eyes are opened. And in the movie, the main character, Neo, he's awakened to what is actually taking place behind the scenes. His eyes are opened, and he has this perception now of a true reality. A lot like in The Wizard of Oz, there's something more that's happening behind the curtain. And the reason why I note this is because similarly, if we could have our eyes opened, if we could get a glimpse behind the curtain of reality that we live in, we would actually have a far greater clarity about the driving forces that exist behind what we can see, or beyond what we can see. That there's a battle that's raging outside of our sight, and yet is nonetheless impacting the experiences that we have every day. And the other question, or the other reality that we need to wrestle is that once we have that knowledge of what's happening behind the curtain, this battle that's happening behind a curtain, we then need to wrestle with what are we then supposed to do with that knowledge. Now today we're continuing our series in the book of Daniel, and we now turn to the longest vision. This vision, it spans 3 different chapters. We're of course going to be starting here in chapter 10. We'll be concluding in the coming weeks through chapter 12. And in the course of our look at this vision, starting here in chapter 10, we begin to see why history develops the ways that it does, which will then set us up for future weeks where we can see how history moves over the course of time. But today, we get this first glimpse of what Daniel saw behind the curtain. Specifically, that there is this unseen spiritual battle that's always raging behind the physical battles that we might experience on the surface. And because that is true, we need to grapple with what that means for us to wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, as we're told. What can we learn about spiritual warfare here in Daniel 10? We'll consider that. Let's consider 3 things. Let's first consider the burden of battle. Second, the purpose of the battle. And then finally, the strength in the battle. All right, so first, the burden of the battle. We just start with this. We all know the adage that we should never meet our heroes. And of course, the reason why that's like a thing is because we tend to idealize our heroes. And as a result, we don't actually allow them to be human. We have this idealized vision of them. And so our celebrities, our politicians, and activists, and even pastors, we know they all have strengths. That's why we know of them. But they also have weaknesses that we might not want to accept because of this idealized vision of them. But what I find fascinating is that the Bible is very honest about the people that it portrays, the heroes, so to speak. The greatest heroes of the faith are never really presented in idealized terms. You know, they do remarkable things and they live remarkable lives, but the Bible's also honest about how often they are fragile, broken, fearful, sinful people, even the most celebrated characters of the Bible. And Daniel 10 actually gives us a picture of that reality with this prophet, Daniel. I mentioned this last week, but in Ezekiel 14, named Daniel as one of the most righteous men that's ever lived. Daniel is this great prophet who interprets dreams, and he outlives empires, as we've seen. He's witnessed miracles like the lion's den. He's one of the great Hall of Famers in the heroes of faith. And yet, despite all of that, look again at verses 1 through 3. It says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. Let me just pause there for a second. So Daniel, once again, is being given this great vision of great importance. And again, he's being used in this remarkable way. It's just a reminder he's a Hall of Famer. But then look at his response to this great experience that he has in verse 2. It says, at that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until 3 weeks were over. After receiving a vision that is similar to ones that he's interpreted previously, right? He's seen these visions, these prophecies. He's then seen them come to fruition. He's experienced some remarkable things. He has another vision here And instead of being excited by it, he falls into this deep despair. One biblical commentator notes that he's got all the classic signs of depression. He's not eating or sleeping. He doesn't use lotion, which is getting at hygiene. Right? So he's likely not doing just basic hygienic things for himself. He's overwhelmed by it all. I mean, after all the battles that he's fought to stay faithful, after all the miracles that he's witnessed, here, he's left completely spent. And then in verses 5 and 6, we're told that a man comes, a man with shimmering brilliance. And the presence of this man, according to verse 8, it says that Daniel had no strength left and that his face turned deathly pale and he was helpless. So even as he's experiencing these remarkable things, as a result of being a faithful man, he's left spent, now fully in despair. Now, in a moment, we're going to get to what all that imagery might mean, but I do want to highlight what's happening with Daniel and try to dispel, I think, some pretty common assumptions, incorrect assumptions that we might have about the things of God. You know, Daniel, he has been, again, a very faithful man in nearly every way. He has served the Lord faithfully. He has served the kings that have come and gone. He's served them faithfully. He struck that balance that can be so hard for all of us to strike, which is to engage faithfully with the places where God has called us to live and to serve, but doing so in a way that honored the Lord and didn't dishonor the Lord in any way. And one might assume that having lived such a life should mean that his reward for such faithfulness is a life of joy, a life of fulfillment, a life of prosperity, a life of blessing. And yet here he is, depressed, struggling, weak. He's turning his face in shame. He's exhausted. And so, friends, I just want to double click on that to say it is a wrong assumption that faithfulness will in some way lead to a life of fulfillment and joy. It's a wrong assumption that those two things necessarily are tied together. Sometimes faithfulness is the reason for exhaustion and despair. Over the years in my own life and in the lives of many that I've walked with, I have very much experienced this to be true. That faithfulness brings exhaustion and despair. Being faithful to the Lord can bring burdens that, if I'm honest, at times do not seem fair. You know, I've walked with people who, with a desire to honor the Lord in the area of sex, sexual desire, sexuality, they hold fast to God's good design for sex and marriage, especially in the context of a modern culture where holding fast to God's good design sounds crazy. It seems like a surefire way to end up lonely and longing, but they stand firm nonetheless. And in that faithfulness, that desire to be faithful to the Lord, I've seen an assumption at times that faithfulness in that area means God's going to bless them with a spouse who is the love of their life, and they'll have the sex of their dreams. But in their commitment to God, that person that they long for never comes. And as a result, they experience exhaustion, even despair. I've seen some who want to trust the Lord with their work, their careers, trying to be a faithful person, being a person of integrity in their dealings. And as they are, they may see people around them succeeding through deception or a lack of integrity, but they want to be faithful. And so they think, surely, if I remain faithful, God's going to promote me. But instead of the promotion, they get laid off. And they end up exhausted, full of despair. Some want to honor the Lord in their generosity, and so they stay committed to that generosity. They stay committed to giving 10% of their income away to kingdom work. They believe, and maybe they've been explicitly told, that if they just sow the seed, God's going to multiply their gift, return to them 100-fold. And so they give, but then week over week, year over year, they keep giving that 10%, trying to be faithful, but in the end still are only able to make what they need, never experiencing the abundance they assumed. And so they end up exhausted and in despair. Some have poured out their lives for the good of others, expecting that their investment in others will mean that they too will be invested in. But then that investment never comes. Some try to honor God with their bodies and try to live a life that is healthy, only to discover that cancer is taking over. Some try to be kind and gentle and compassionate and merciful to others, only to then experience cruelty or violence or injustice inflicted on them. And in the end, they experience exhaustion and despair. I mean, we have categories for bad people suffering. You know, it's easy to think, sure, bad people deserve suffering. But we do not have categories for bad people thriving and faithful people struggling. It doesn't seem fair. And it's not what we expect when we're just trying to be faithful. But the question I think I would have for all of us that at times struggle with that is, why is it that we struggle with that idea? What is it that seems so unfair about it all? Well, when we make those assumptions, I do think we often have more of a karmic view of God than we do a biblical view of God and reality. Meaning, if I'm good, I should get good. If I'm bad, I should get bad. This is karma at its core. But the Christian faith has always been something different than that. I mean, just think about the central figure of our faith. Jesus himself was crucified by religious and civic leaders of his day because he was faithful. He's the only person that lived a truly sinless life, and yet he suffered greatly. And if that's the case for Jesus, why would that not be, at some measure, also the case for us? Faithfulness does not guarantee no suffering, no exhaustion, no despair. In fact, sometimes faithfulness will be the reason for the suffering. And in the context of spiritual warfare, a burden of the battle of fighting the good fight of faithfulness can be that with that fight comes exhaustion and despair. So the question then for us is this: if that's true, where is God when I am fighting the good fight of faithfulness that ultimately leads to exhaustion and despair? What is God doing in the midst of those seasons? Let's look at, secondly, the purpose of the battle. So Daniel has this great revelation about a great war. And it says that the understanding of the message came to him in a vision, verse 2, and that at that time I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. And then in verse 12, it tells us that over the course of 21 days, 3 weeks, Daniel attempted to gain understanding, it says, and to humble himself before God. In other words, during this season of exhaustion and despair, Daniel fixes his eyes on the Lord, seeking the Lord for answers, seeking God for a measure of understanding. And in particular, Daniel is struggling to know what's going to happen to his people. If you've been with us over the course of this series, Daniel's people, they've been in exile. They're longing to go back home. And it seems like that return back home is just on the horizon. And yet, the future still seems very uncertain, even though God had promised that they would one day return home. And Daniel here, he's longing to know the destiny of his people. And here's what I think we can ascertain from this 21 days, this time of prayer that Daniel is engaged in, seeking the Lord. And just track with me for a minute. Verse 13 indicates that there were these malicious plans against Israel by Persian officials. If you want to read more about that, you can read it in Ezra 4. But then this shimmering figure, this man, comes and says that these officials are resisting God, but that angels have come, that they're protecting God's people, and that they're actually thwarting the plans of this enemy, these Persian enemies. In other words, angels fought a spiritual battle to protect God's people from the schemes of their enemies. This is what we're to understand. But here's what's wild to me, anyway. Look at verse 12. Verse 12 says, "Do not be afraid, Daniel." This is what this shimmering man comes to say. "Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them." Do you catch what's happening there? For 21 days, the Persian officials were set against God's people. For 21 days, Daniel was praying to the Lord for his people. For 21 days, Daniel was exhausted and in despair, and he seemed to receive no response from God. But then this shimmering figure now comes and says, Daniel, since the day you started praying, since the day you set your mind to gain understanding and humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. God heard Daniel's prayer and was moving in response to them, even as Daniel was trapped in this weeks-long despair. The angel came in response to his prayer and began fighting the schemes of the enemy. And on the 21st day, after the 3 weeks were over, Daniel was told about the angels that went to war in response to his prayer. Here's what I find fascinating about this. God chose to push Daniel to pray through this experience of exhaustion and despair. It drew Daniel to his knees. And then God used those prayers of Daniel to propel a spiritual battle. God didn't need to do it that way, but that's exactly what he does. And I heard one fellow pastor put it this way. Let me just read to you what he said. He said, God seems to choose this inefficient way in Daniel 10. He moves his servant to pray for his people. Then, in response to the sweat and struggle of prayer, he begins to bring help to his people. I have come because of your words, we're told there. Daniel prayed, and the angel went to war. God used Daniel's exhaustion, an exhaustion that led him to cry out to God as the means by which angels were sent to war on behalf of God's people. There is so much to say about that. But again, here's what's wild. As you and I are faithful, it will at times lead to exhaustion and despair. But if we allow that exhaustion and despair to drive us to our knees, to drive us to seek after God, when we are led to press deeper into knowing and understanding God in the midst of hardship, God hears those prayers and uses them to accomplish his purposes. That might sound, as was said, incredibly inefficient, but it's also remarkable. And the reason why it's remarkable is because God chooses to use us in accomplishing his purposes by using our prayers as a weapon against the enemy, those who had set themselves against God. God welcomes us into the battle by letting us pray. I don't fully understand what that looks like or what that means, but it reminds me of James 5. If you know that passage, where James says that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. You know, though in context, James is talking about confession there, I think it still very much applies. When we seek to be faithful, challenges are going to come. But when those challenges force us to fix our eyes on the Lord and lead us to pray, God makes those prayers powerful and effective. The other thing that I want to say about this, especially in the context of spiritual warfare, is I also want to highlight the fact that these prayers, they're oriented toward God. And that seems pretty key to me as well. Because even in spiritual warfare, the key to that warfare is not focusing on our enemies. Rather, spiritual warfare is wanting to know God more than wanting to defeat our enemies. It's wanting to love and serve God more than it is going to war against our enemies. Wanting to humble ourselves before God more than we want to conquer our enemies. Spiritual warfare is fixing our eyes on God and trusting in his goodness and his good purposes, purposes that we might not understand right now. When we are exhausted and in despair over all the different areas of life, if we are faithful and pray, God will use those prayers powerfully and effectively. And when we're exhausted and in despair over our desires in sex and relationships, be faithful and trust the Lord will use those prayers powerfully and effectively for his purposes, whatever they might be. When we're exhausted and in despair over our desires in work and career, be faithful and pray and trust the Lord will use those prayers powerfully and effectively for purposes that we might not be able to understand right now. When we are exhausted and in despair over our finances, be faithful and pray and trust that the Lord will use those prayers powerfully and effectively for his purposes. When we are exhausted and in despair over our desires to love and serve others, be faithful and pray. And trust that the Lord will use those prayers powerfully and effectively for his purposes, whatever they might be. And like Daniel, we might not have any idea what's going on. No idea what to expect or what our prayers are doing. In fact, it might seem like God is not there and not listening in the midst of those prayers. But in our faithful pursuit of him, I trust that verse 12 will also be true for us as well, that from the first day we set our minds to gain understanding and to humble ourselves before God, our words will be heard and God will respond. Now, with all that said, we could just leave it there, and I think that would be enough for us to wrestle with. But to leave it just there, I also think would be a bit of a cold comfort for many, meaning essentially what's been said so far is, hey, be faithful. It's going to be hard. You're going to experience exhaustion and despair, but don't worry. When you pray in the midst of that struggle, God will be at work. Sure, that's true, but we're still exhausted and still in despair. Is that really all that we can take from this passage? That we just need to double down, be faithful, and pray? No. There's one more thing worth seeing in this passage that is actually the strength for us in the midst of our battle when exhaustion and despair come. I'll start by saying this. I had never noticed something in this passage until I started researching and reading some others who were also reflecting on this passage. And one theologian in particular pointed out that much of this chapter centers on this glorious, majestic figure that shows up. And in particular, when he comes, he touches Daniel 3 times in 3 different ways. And within those touches, we see these gifts that are given to Daniel that present a glimpse of the gospel. Because in the midst of Daniel's exhaustion, despair, and struggle, God meets him profoundly through these touches and these gifts. Let me show you these 3 touches here. First, in verse 10 is touch number 1. It says, "A hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees." So just to first point out, a hand came and touched. Close enough, near enough to touch. Now, this figure comes and doesn't launch, as Daniel's praying, he doesn't launch into explanations with what Daniel's supposed to do or some to-do list that Daniel should get up and go do. Instead, this figure just comes and touches him. And so this first touch, the gift that's given, is just a gift of nearness. This figure comes near. Second, when the man in white, the shimmering figure comes, in verse 11, he gives Daniel these words of encouragement and says, "Oh, Daniel, man greatly loved, stand upright." Right? He's encouraging Daniel with these words. But Daniel's response to hearing those words are not gladness or praise for those words. Instead, it says in verse 15 that Daniel turns his face away and he goes mute. He doesn't talk. In other words, when Daniel is confronted by this glorious being, he immediately feels the weight of his imperfection, and he feels shame. In verse 15, it says that he bowed his face toward the ground and was speechless. I mean, this is a lot like in Isaiah 6, when Isaiah experiences the presence of God. You remember his reaction? His reaction is to say, "Woe is me. I am ruined, for I am a man with unclean lips." He feels the weight of his own sin. And in response to this figure that has come in verse 16, he comes knowing that Daniel's experiencing this shame, and he touches Daniel's lips. And then Daniel is able to speak. In other words, the figure comes and extends to Daniel grace, such that Daniel is now able to speak. This second touch is a gift of grace. So not only has Daniel been touched with just presence, the nearness of this figure, now he's graciously being welcomed through this gift of grace. And then finally, the third touch, verses 18 and 19. It says, again, one having the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me and said, O man greatly loved, fear not. Peace be with you. Be strong and good courage. This is the first time in this passage where the word peace is spoken. And it's through this touch. In this touch, there is this gift of peace that's being extended. The shimmering figure, to summarize all of that, this shimmering figure comes, and the three gifts are given through these touches: the gift of nearness, the gift of grace, and the gift of peace. So the question then is, who is this shimmering figure that comes with these gifts? That comes with these gifts of nearness and grace and peace. I don't know about you, but especially in the midst of hard, exhausting times, I would also love to experience gifts of nearness, gifts of grace, gifts of peace. So who is this figure? Well, the description of this man are almost identical to the descriptions made in the book of Revelation about Jesus. Granted, there's some debate, but this seems to be a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus with Daniel. And that would track, given all that Jesus accomplishes. I mean, who is Jesus? Think about it. The incarnate Jesus comes because we could not reach up to him. So he came down to us and gave us his presence, the gift of nearness. The incarnate Jesus comes and extends grace to those who, like Daniel, would otherwise wallow in their shame. And so he extends them the gift of grace. The incarnate Jesus comes. And in John 14, like the figure describes, Jesus says, peace I leave you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. That sounds a lot like what the shimmering figure says to Daniel. The spiritual warfare and the gifts of God in Daniel 10 reach their definitive expression when the Son of God comes. When Jesus comes, when the Word becomes flesh. In his presence, his nearness, Jesus reminds us that he is the one who will fight every battle for us. Every spiritual battle is his. He is the one who will be victorious in the end. He is the one who is near to us, gracious to us, the one who gives us his peace. In the midst of battle, in the midst of our pursuits of faithfulness, what more could we need than the nearness and grace and peace of Jesus? I mean, friends, I'll close with this. Faithfulness, to be clear, will at times lead to exhaustion and despair. And pursuits of that faithfulness will be a very real spiritual battle. But I trust that the same God who showed up for Daniel is the same God who desires to show up for us, who hears our prayers, sees our desire to be faithful, and will be at work even in ways that we cannot fully understand, and will, in the midst of that battle, strengthen us with gifts of nearness and grace and peace. And so my encouragement would simply be this: continue to be faithful, continue to pray, trust that God hears you, and trust that he will meet you even in the midst of your exhaustion and despair, and gift you what you need to continue that faithfulness. I ask that the Spirit of God would meet us in that way profoundly, especially for those of us here that are struggling, exhausted, and in despair. May that be true. Let's pray together. Our Father, we thank you for your good gifts. Lord, you gift us so many things, especially in Jesus. It's in Jesus where we experience your nearness, your presence with us. It's in Jesus that we experience the fullness of your grace, where you extend to us that which we cannot earn and that which we do not deserve. Lord, we thank you for your peace that reminds us that even in the midst of storms, you're a God who quiets storms, and that you're a God who perseveres us. And so, Lord, I pray for those, especially that might be here, that as they've sought to be faithful in various areas of their lives, it feels like a spiritual war is raging as they seek to be faithful. And Lord, it's true. There is a spiritual battle that is raging. But Lord, I pray that we would have our own experiences of those touches, and that you would remind us what you have given to us in Jesus. And may that strengthen us for the battle. Make us a praying, faithful people who trust you in all things. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.